Hi guys, and welcome back to Christian Nerds Unite. Today we're going to talk about some of my favorite classic sci-fi novels. And we'll get to that right after this. The beginning of a new year is when many people start thinking about their goals, and I'm no exception. The Goal Process 101 ebook has helped me clarify the best and most achievable goals for me, plus helped me set a plan in place to accomplish them. I mean, this podcast is just one of the results of using the Goal Process 101 ebook. Check it out at christiannerdsunite.com/goals. It helped me. I'm sure it can help you too. Now, back to the show. Today's episode ended up being a lot longer than I expected. So this is actually going to be a two-part episode. So welcome to part one, and we'll see you next week for part two. Welcome back. Like I said, today we're going to talk all about some classic sci-fi novels that I really love. Now, just be upfront, this isn't the end-all and be-all of classic sci-fi novels. There are definitely some other ones out there that are fantastic that I don't have on my list, but these are ones I really enjoy. Before we get to that, I do want to read scripture, like always. I'm only going to read one scripture today. Matthew 13:34 through 35. Jesus spoke all these things to the crowd in parables. He did not say anything to them without using a parable. So was fulfilled what was spoken through the prophet. I will open my mouth in parables. I will utter things hidden since the creation of the world. Now, talking about parables, a lot of these classic novels that I'm going to talk about, a large majority of them do have a lot of symbolic meaning behind them. Some of them are definitely just for fun, but several of them really are part of the time they were written. They are allegories or parables, or at least allude to situations that were going on right then in the world. And that's something I really love about these classic novels. They really make you think about some things that were going on then and still are going on today. Now, I've got a pretty long list of books, and all of them are pre-1985. And now that's on purpose. I really wanted these to be classic novels. I'm not looking at newer things, no Ready Player One on the list. We're not looking at books that are based on some TV shows that you might be familiar with. We're also not looking at fantasy books. So this list is not going to have Tolkien on it. We're not going to see any of those high fantasy medieval knight kind of exciting books. I love those too, but that's not what we're going to talk about today. We're going to focus in specifically on science fiction. Now, when we talk about science fiction, there is a word that gets thrown around sometimes in science fiction. They use the term hard science fiction. And that's a question that some people have. What does that actually mean? Usually when we're talking about hard science fiction, we're talking about science fiction where the concept of science and accuracy and logic is actually used in the book. Also, another thing that's often thrown in for hard science fiction is when technology is explained, even if it's not accurate today, but the technology is explained in such a way that you can visualize what it is, how it works. Those are the things that deal with hard science fiction. I really love hard science fiction. Some of these are definitely not hard science fiction. Some of them are just bizarre. And we're going to start out with probably the strangest one, The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. Now, if you probably are familiar with this book, you've probably heard the term, the saying, the answer to the ultimate question is 42. Those are things that we associate with this book. The Hitchhiker's Guide, as described in the book, it's with large friendly type that says "Don't panic," but it is, honestly, it's a great little series. It is fun. There is no hard science fiction here at all. Although they do try to explain some things, but they explain them in the most bizarre ways they possibly can. Now, if you didn't know, this was actually a series that started based on a radio play. It was not a book first. And that's pretty unusual for everything else on this list. It is often said that it is a trilogy in 5 parts, although now there are 6 books. Don't ask. Well, I'll go into it actually. But there are 6 books. We've got The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, obviously the first one, and personally, by far the best in my opinion. The next, we have The Restaurant at the End of the Universe, which is also really good. Life, the Universe, and Everything, which is the 3rd book, and you should just stop there. Just stop. Don't read the rest of them. They didn't need to happen. Now, this is definitely my personal opinion, and I could be persuaded otherwise, but I doubt it. The first 3 books really feel like a complete story. They have a complete story arc. It makes sense. Then we pick up after that. We have So Long and Thanks for All the Fish, Mostly Harmless, and then a book called And Another Thing. They all try to continue the story, but they continue the story in some strange ways that I don't feel like they fit in as good as the first 3 books did. They're not as cohesive at all. Things get shuffled around more. And if you look into it, you'll find that some of these books were actually originally going to be written as a different character even, and he decided it made more sense in the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy universe, so he switched it back. There's some weird things going on there. So I recommend reading the first 3 and just stopping at that point. Another thing to point out is that last book, the 6th book, it's called And Another Thing. It's not actually written by Douglas Adams. It is the same characters. It is an attempt to finish the 2nd trilogy, and it is endorsed by the widow of Douglas Adams, but it wasn't actually written by him. It does have the feeling of a Douglas Adams novel, but I don't think it's as good as the rest. One of the other famous quotes from this book you might have heard is, a common mistake that people make when trying to design something completely foolproof is to underestimate the ingenuity of complete fools. And that is a great example of what this book is all about. It is bizarre things, unlikely things happening, the earth being destroyed because, we're making a bypass, which is, it also ties into the very beginning of the book where his house is being destroyed to make way for a road. It definitely is an odd little collection of books, definitely worth your read. Number 2, and this is probably the newest book on I think this is actually the newest book on the list, and it's Ender's Game. And this book gets some hate, and especially since the movie came out. The movie didn't go well, and a lot of people disliked the movie. I think the Ender's Game book is really good. Now, the Ender's universe, it's vast. I'm not even sure the number of books. It may be 10 or 12. It may actually be more. but the Ender's verse is pretty substantial. We've got prequels, we've got sequels, we have parallel books, books that are telling stories that happen as Ender's story is going on, and Ender is the main character. The basic premise is Ender is a young child that has been watched and trained, and it is obvious that he's going to make a great potential military leader. They take him off to a military school and train him and to play these military games. And in the end, these are going to give you spoiler alerts right now. A lot of these books I will spoil for you. So if you don't want them spoiled, then don't read this. But I feel comfortable spoiling a book that is 35 years old now. In the end, he's playing what he thinks is a large simulation, and in reality, he is commanding a real life military campaign that is being played out as he is giving commands, and they defeat the enemy, completely obliterating their civilization, not just defeating them. And that is a big part of this story. Ender is, has these mental issues that are going on all through the book. And we find out he struggled with all these things of being in control and being protected. And now he's the military leader. He is the guy that is going to take the earth and put them in a position where they can win this war. And once he does, the military leadership is almost appalled. They're happy that it's over, but they are appalled in the way he does it. Now, that is something that carries over into the future books, and that's something that I want to share. Two other books from the series, Speaker for the Dead and Xenocide. Honestly, these are even better books. They're much better. They're much more focused on Ender's struggle to deal with what he has done in his past. Speaker for the Dead kind of tells you in the title that he is speaking for those that he has destroyed. And then the Xenocide is kind of his exile because he destroyed this entire world, and his process that he is going through. It's the guilt, it's the remorse, and it's an attempt at redemption. It is definitely a great series. I wouldn't necessarily recommend the entire Ender's verse because it's so broad and so diverse, and it gets so strange and weird. Some of the books are really great, but the main three, Ender's Game, Speaker for the Dead, and Xenocide, make a great trilogy. Next, I have the Foundation trilogy. Now, I say the Foundation trilogy, once again, there are lots of other Foundation books as time went on. But it started out as basically a trilogy. It's a band of psychologists under the leadership of a gentleman who's created a science called psychohistory, a psychohistorian called Harry Seldon. He wants to plant a colony to encourage art, science, and technology so that they can carry on the knowledge of humans after the Galactic Empire falls, which he has predicted. And that is a big part of this story. It's the idea that you can mathematically predict things, but only on a very large scale. He can't predict what you will do tomorrow. He can't predict what a leader will do in a particular situation. But through this idea, this mathematical idea of psychohistory, which gets a little weird, it's psychology, it's history, and it's math, and they're all blended together. But through this science of psychohistory, he can predict very large scale things. He can predict that the Galactic Empire will end in 500 years. Now, he can't tell you how it's going to end, but he can see from everything that's going on that it will. And this gets him in big trouble with the government. And, actually the book starts out with a trial. The novels all have common threads, and they're all weaved in and out of each other, but they have vastly different settings, vastly different characters. We talked earlier about The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. If you read you read all 6 books, basically you have one set of characters that goes all the way through, with a few odds and ends added here and there, and a couple people leaving here and there. But primarily, you follow the path of this one set of people. Foundation is not like that. Foundation is different settings, different characters, different time frames, and in some instances it's centuries between books. And even in the first book, we actually, between 2 sections of the book, we actually jump a huge period of time where all the people we were just following are no longer alive because of old age. They've simply passed away, and they've been replaced by a whole new group of people to follow. So it can get a little heavy, and it can get a little dense, and it can be hard to follow. I think it's worth your time. Another interesting thing is, if you read the broader universe from Foundation, you find out that Isaac Asimov actually ties this into his Robot series. And that's something we'll mention here in just a little bit. The Foundation series started in 1942, and it is a great series. A lot of people go, how good can a sci-fi book be from 1942? It's amazing how well these old classic sci-fi books still hold up, even almost 80 years later. Another trilogy that I'm going to say is pretty good. It's really weird. And we are a Christian podcast, so I couldn't not mention them. It's the Space Trilogy from C.S. Lewis. If you've not read it, it's worth your time to read. It is a little odd. It's different than any of the other book series on this list. It's not a dense read. It's not a hard read. The novels are actually fairly short. We have this philologist. A philologist is a person who studies the history of languages, and that definitely is right up C.S. Lewis's, right up his alley. But a philologist named Edwin Ransom, he travels to Mars, he travels to Venus, and then we have a third book where he's on Earth. Now, these books were the first book, Out of Silent Planet. It's 1938. So this is a very early book. It's not the earliest book on this list, but it's a very early book for sci-fi. But I would actually qualify this more as space fantasy than true science fiction, because it is definitely not a hard science fiction book. The technology that's talked about doesn't make sense at all. It's obvious that if C.S. Lewis understood anything about what was going on in the field of science and flight and the possibility of going to space, if he had any ideas at all, then he just ignored them and created his own little process. Now, I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying that's what this book is, and I want you to know that. So, Out of a Silent Planet, it's set mostly on Mars. And Ransom voyages to Mars, discovers that Earth is actually in exile from the rest of the solar system, that all of the different planets have people living on them, but Earth has been set aside and it's been exiled from the rest. Because far back in Earth's past, it fell to an angelic being. Now, once again, this is C.S. Lewis. This is the Chronicles of Narnia guy. C.S. Lewis is known for his allegory and parable stories. And this is right up there. He is highly tying this into his personal faith and belief. So he discovers that Earth's in exile, it's fallen to an angelic being, and now to prevent contamination to the rest of the solar system, it's known as the silent planet, Earth is. And so the story follows him and people that follow him that are they're the bad guys, and they are disrupting the peace of Mars. We have a very similar story in the second novel. It's called Paralandra, 1943, and it's set mostly on Venus. Once again, Dr. Ransom travels to Venus. It's a strange way to travel. He's traveling in a box that feels like a coffin. And in this one's interesting because the narrator of the book at the very beginning is actually C.S. Lewis himself, saying that I met Dr. Ransom. This is another reason I say these books get a little strange, because in the first book, it was all about Dr. Ransom. In the second book, it's C.S. Lewis meeting this guy named Dr. Ransom and helping him on his way. And he goes to Venus, and this is definitely a Garden of Eden allegory. We've got an Adam and an Eve, and then we have the bad guy showing up and trying to spoil the garden, playing the part of kind of the Satan in the story. Then we have the third book, and it is once again completely different. We've got That Hideous Strength. That's the name of the book, 1945. And it's all set on Earth. And we've got a scientific think tank called NICE, NICE, the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. It's a secret society. They're in touch with demonic entities. So we've got that spiritual angle again. And all of these books have angelic beings existing in the universe. So that's, once again, we've got that spiritual overlay into all of these books. It's a demonic entity that these people are working with, and they plan to ravage and lay waste to the entire planet. It does get a little odd because once again, we're following Dr. Ransom, but we get into some odd King Arthur references, and the antagonist completely changes. The first two books had the same antagonist, basically. And then the third book, we have a whole different person, a whole different group of people that are the bad guys. We have, Dr. Ransom suddenly now, rather than just being a human that's thrown into this strange world, we have Dr. Ransom, who is large and in charge and has mental powers and can speak with animals, and he has grown tremendously just from book to book, and we don't see there's not a character growth there. It's just instantaneous when the book starts that he is a changed person, but Dr. Ransom is still the protagonist of the book. Once again, I think these are good books. They are by far not my favorite books on this list. I think the Chronicles of Narnia books are much better from C.S. Lewis, but they are definitely worth a read. And if you like that spiritual angle in your science fiction, you will enjoy these three books. Next, we have I, Robot by Isaac Asimov. It's 1950. And many of you are probably familiar with the idea of the Robot series. These are great books. I have not read all of the Robot series. I have read some of the books where the Robot series mingles with the Foundation series, and that gets kind of interesting. And I like that section of the Foundation series a lot, because it's a lot more linear, where we're not time jumping quite as much in those books. But iRobot is very specifically, it is not a novel per se. It's a series of related and somewhat interconnected stories. Now, what I have read about how this came about, Asimov had written all of these different robot stories, and his publisher basically came to him and said, we want you to do a novel of robot, in the robot series. And, maybe you could take all of your robot stories that you have, figure out how to rework them into one cohesive novel. So rather than just turn them into a full novel that makes sense as a novel, rather than do that, he decided to choose a character, a single person, that he would set up an interview for. And she was a robo-psychologist. Yeah, you got that right. A robo-psychologist, a psychologist for robots. And so she's being interviewed by a journalist, and she begins to tell these stories about the early days of robotics and through to today, and different things that the journalist asks about. So that's where each of these stories comes from. Asimov, as you know, in iRobot, he lays out the 3 laws of robotics, and we see this across the board in tons and tons of different science fiction through the ages. We've got, the 3 basic laws. A robot may not injure a human being or, through inaction, allow a human being to come to harm. 2. A robot must obey the orders given it by human beings, except where such orders would conflict with the first law. 3. A robot must protect its own existence as long as such protection does not conflict with the first and second law. Now, this is an amazing process that Isaac Asimov set up in these 3 laws. And the premise of the book basically is robots going crazy because of the 3 laws. Either trying to fulfill them as is, the conflict that arises because of the 3 laws is a major theme throughout many of the stories. And then we see others where they have modified the 3 laws. So when we're looking at stories where the laws conflict, we've got a story where we have a supercomputer in 2 major countries that are trying to create interstellar flight, and they find out that, this other country's supercomputer basically went crazy trying to solve the problem. And they're trying to make sure their supercomputer doesn't go crazy as well, because once it went crazy, it was useless. So rather than modifying the 3 laws, they coax the computer into ignoring a few things along the way. And in the end, we find out that it wasn't willing to build the ship initially because it knew building the ship would kill the people that were in the ship. But once it skipped past that ability, once it skipped past the idea that it would kill them, it realized that they would come back to life at the other end. And so it was only temporarily killing them, and it was able to build a ship. It was the only one that could control it, and it sends a couple people into space, and they have a bizarre experience, and the computer still goes pretty crazy. So fascinating story. Another one of the stories where the 3 laws conflict is, it gets to a story of sending the robot out to do a very specific task, but then once it starts doing the task, it finds that it's in conflict with the 3rd law because it is going to damage itself if it proceeds to complete the task. But if it steps away from the task, then it once again is trying to obey the orders that it's given it, and it gets into an infinite loop. Then some of the stories talk about the results of modifying the three laws and how bad that can be. That's where we get the story. If you've seen the movie I, Robot, that is the premise of that movie, is this one story in I, Robot, the book, where we have an android, a robot that is hiding because the three laws were slightly modified, and it causes great strife in finding the robot. By the way, that movie is nothing like the book. So I think the book is great. I love reading this book. I probably read it, once every couple of years, just for the fun of it. Now, I think this is the oldest book on my list. It's 1895, The Time Machine by H.G. Wells. It's a classic book. There is a great movie from, I think, the 70s that's actually pretty accurate to the book. But a British inventor creates a device that sends him into the future, and he finds there are basically everything that's happened. The world falls to nuclear war. By the way, most of these books, the world has fallen to nuclear war. Just happens. The world is destroyed, and there is a new civilization brought up. And in this world now, there are basically just two races. There's the Morlocks and the Eloi, and the Morlocks are basically grooming the Eloi to kill them and eat them eventually. It's a great adventure story. It's less hard science fiction than it is just an adventure story that has a time travel and science fiction theme. It is a great book, definitely worth the read. Some interesting ideas about time travel in the Time Machine. One of the big things is it is a time machine only. It does not travel in space. So in order for the time machine to move, you physically have to drag it from place to place because he didn't put wheels on it. They don't talk about the fact he doesn't put wheels on it, but that is kind of a bit in the book that, there's a spot where you can see the path where it has been drug. But there's a big flaw in that, is like, well, what if you show up in a time where there's a wall where you are? That could be a problem. And then there's the idea of, in the movie, there's a great scene where he's going into the future, and suddenly he realizes he's in the middle of a mountain. That a mountain has grown up where he is. So he can't obviously stop right then. He's got to go further into the future. But it's a great book, definitely worth the read. Today's episode ended up being a lot longer than I expected. So this is actually going to be a 2-part episode, and we'll see you next week for part 2.